Hi, and welcome to the Renewable Roundup podcast from Schneider Electric. I'm Russell Redding, Head of Energy Markets here at Zygo. Every week, I'm going to bring you some top stories, critical climate topics, insights, and expert voices. So please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss a thing. This week, I'm joined by Craig Konz of the Renewable Energy and Carbon Advisory Team to talk about PPAs and storage. I thought this would be interesting, and then I found out that Craig is a mountain biker like me. So, will we talk about PPAs and storage, or is this a podcast 30 minutes of mountain biking? You're going to have to listen and find out. Hi Craig, thanks for joining me this week, and how are you doing?
Hello, Russell. I am doing well. Thank you for having me here.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you for agreeing to be my victim, shall we say, this week. So, for the people listening, would you just like to quickly introduce yourself and tell everyone a bit about what you do?
Sure. I live in Durango, Colorado, so the home of the most recent World Cup downhill mountain bike winner. We're a proud town of our mountain bikers. And work at Schneider Electric in the renewable energy advisory business. So in that role, I help companies buy renewable energy, mostly through power purchase agreements, PPAs, and help them find their best options, go to market, meet with developers, get different offers on the table, then assess those offers from a financial perspective, from a risk perspective, and then ultimately negotiate the term sheet and the contracts for those projects.
Fabulous. That's great. Also very exciting. I love mountain biking. I've made my way into Europe, but I've never made my way to Colorado yet. So maybe one day I'll make it over there. I might have to ask you for some advice on the trails.
Oh, you do? Yes. Please come to Colorado and to Southwest Colorado. It's tons of great trails here.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to it already. Anyway, before we spend the entire podcast talking about mountain biking, unfortunately, I'm going to have to ask you a bit about PPAs, to be honest with you. So obviously, you deal with a lot of corporates, and I hear all sorts of things. But do you think that corporates currently want optionality for storage in virtual PPAs from what you're sort of seeing?
Yes, I think they would. Many companies want to support renewables and meet their environmental goals, and they want to do this probably, ideally with less financial risk than typically comes with a power purchase agreement. They're not doing a power purchase agreement for that financial exposure. They're doing it for the environmental benefit, for contracting for renewables to meet their goals, all the great things that come with renewable energy. So if they can get all that and then plus reduce the financial risk, I think that's definitely something that they would consider.
Okay, that's really interesting. I kind of, in my head, I sort of see that, if you've got storage in a VPPA, it's sort of providing a bit of a little bit of extra insurance. You talked about things like reducing the risk and what have you. But do you think that companies see that insurance and are happy to pay for it?
Yeah, well, I think some do and some don't. And to be honest, it's going to be project and situation dependent, but sometimes adding storage to the PPA will be extremely helpful from a financial and hedging and risk perspective. And sometimes it might not really impact the economics at all. It might not help those economics. So, just as, most companies are pretty financially risk averse when they're outside of their core business, of which energy and renewable energy PPAs almost always are. I think that there could certainly be interest in paying more upfront in return for reducing that potential downside exposure.
Okay, so I think if what you're saying is I like how you opened, Craig. It's like, well, some will and some won't. I guess that's the case for everything. But I guess what it comes down to then is from what you're saying is that that kind of financial analysis of that case, and if it works, you know, say you're working with people who are financially risk averse, and they can look at that and they're saying, well, yes, actually the numbers make sense because I'm reducing the risk, the downside risk. Yes, I'm paying a bit more upfront to do that, but that works for their corporate profile. Then I guess the answer is probably yes. But if they don't, it's less likely that they might see the benefit.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that.
Cool, that's excellent. So obviously we've kind of talked a little bit about the financial benefits and you know, the risk reduction, but for me, I think my understanding is that there are all sorts of other benefits of having storage. You know, we might call non-financial benefits. Do you want to just kind of outline your kind of view of what corporates might see in terms of non-financial benefits by including storage as part of a PPA?
Yeah, and I think that's an important component as well because storage does so much. You know, it helps with the grid stability and grid support, which we know is absolutely critical, especially in North America and even in Europe, as I understand. You know, the community resilience aspect and grid hardening, the also just the ability to add more renewable energy to the grid when storage exists. So all of these great things, and you know, the impact story, as noted earlier, from renewable energy PPAs is one of really the key things that corporates and companies contracting for renewable energy are really looking for. So storage just, you know, adds to that story as well. All the all the reasons we just talked about also are related to storage and providing impact and all those things that companies want. And then another non-financial benefit, or at least kind of a thought of mine, is that companies that use IFRS reporting from an accounting perspective and need to report the contract's fair market value on a quarterly basis are almost always looking to reduce those mark-to-market swings. So this could also help with that from a reporting perspective.
That's a really interesting one because you know, to pick up your comment from Europe, you know, absolutely, you know, grid support, grid stability is potentially monetizable. There can be other sort of other impacts like if you've got a limited connection, adding the storage to the PPA could actually make the PPA, should we say, connectable to the grid because the storage can manage that. And it's and there are lots of kind of interesting ways, obviously, dependent on how the PPA is structured and where the battery is as well, and things like that. But actually, the point about mark-to-market swings is a really, really good one because corporates love stability, I guess, which, or many do, which obviously, you know, we talk about reducing the financial risk and increasing stability is great, but actually also if you've got a benefit under the accounting, because again, and I've seen this in other businesses where you've got mark-to-market valuation of part of the portfolio, and through no fault of your own, the price of the underlying energy swings and your mark-to-market swings. The kind of the finance teams hate that because you know, the numbers are changing so much, and if actually you can structure something that would reduce that, I think that's actually quite an exciting. Sorry, did I say exciting about something that reduces to accounting? But what I'm you know, that could be quite exciting for the accounting department. Should I jokingly say? You know, it's an interesting benefit, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And, you know, it would have to be run to ground with each company's individual accounting firm and their auditors. But that's all part of the process that we provide is, you know, getting working with those teams and helping them get into the weeds to understand those nuances. And yeah, it's just, as I've learned, accounting is very specific to each company. So this is just another potential benefit of storage and the ultimate risk reduction that storage can provide.
Yeah, no, that's really good. So when I kind of looking at the sort of almost hybrid offers, the PPA plus storage offers, I feel like from my foot in the US and Europe, um, it, there's the offers, should we say, are evolving. It's quite an emerging and a reasonably new market in terms of bringing those two things together, and so I feel like we're seeing a lot of not not testing, but testing. Like, does this work? How is that going to, the offers can have all sorts of different things in as developers try and work out what works and what sort of presses those buttons for corporates. And in some areas like Spain, we in Europe, we're seeing quite a lot of offers coming through and how they're evolving. Would you say that you're seeing PPA offers coming through, including storage, and do they provide value for corporates? How do they do that?
Yeah, good question. And you are correct that at least in my experience, PPA storage with PPAs has been pretty limited, but it is evolving. So in the US, we've seen storage included in PPAs structured as the arbitrage value. So essentially what that means is trading, like for instance, the four lowest price hours in the day for the four highest price hours in the day.
Hmm.
And that has generally kind of come at a decent price premium. It's basically just a additional cost to the PPA. So the PPA is a little bit more expensive. That strike price is a little bit higher, and then you get that arbitrage value of every day trading those four lowest price hours for the four highest price hours. So, you know, just to be honest, to date, companies have generally decided that it's not worth the cost. But I also think that companies are really kind of, when they're thinking that, they're considering the most probable scenario where the storage price kind of drags down that overall NPV. And if they are looking at it, I love that you started out kind of saying this is an insurance product. So if they are looking at it as an insurance product or looking at it from that risk reduction perspective, and they're just, instead of looking at the base cases, they start looking at the more bearish scenarios. I think that their thinking on it could change and they could be more interested in it. And, it all depends again on the specific offer and project and so forth. But I think there is certainly an opportunity there in the US. And then even more than that structure that we've seen in the US, in the EU, I've heard of storage being included in PPAs, but it's basically structured as, again, paying a few extra dollars in the PPA price, but then you get a percentage of the total battery revenue. So whether that's, 5% or 10% or 30%, whatever it might be, depend on the price, of course. But that revenue share is going to include really any product that the storage can provide, whether that's available now or in the future. So that means, like, in addition to just the arbitrage value, capacity value, resource adequacy, ancillary services, black start, all the things, I'm not a technical battery expert, but all the things that batteries can provide, and there are a lot of them. Any of those, the client, our Schneider's client, my client, the corporate PP off-taker could also then benefit from. And I really love the idea of it being not just, what's contemplated today, but what can happen down the road in the future. These are long-term 15-year contracts, generally, maybe 10 to 15-year contracts. So a lot of things can change, and we know the grid is evolving. These offers are evolving. So let's allow these offers to, these structures to evolve with what's actually happening real time in the market.
Yeah. Thanks, Craig. I actually think that's a really good summary. There are bits that there are bits that chime with as you mentioned the US and EU. I think arbitrage, absolutely. I've even seen suggestions of virtual arbitrage, and well, we'll settle on the lowest to highest 2 hours, whether in half hours or hours or whatever. But again, it depends on the metering setup, whether the battery and the renewable generation is metered separately or together. Absolutely seen the structures of saying, well, battery revenues, the percentage of battery revenues up for grabs might be a small amount, it might be a bigger amount once the project has reached a minimum revenue threshold. And at the last point, which actually you've reminded me of really nicely, is there are projects both offering and corporates just negotiating the ability to provide storage in future if it becomes a good point to it, because there's lots of things that can happen obviously between now and where the battery can potentially be of benefit to everybody. And I think what it comes down to is like you say, it is evolving, and the different options are coming to the fore and are being tested, which I think is why it's an exciting time for corporates to look at these, because I think that there are once it becomes standard, whether that is 6 months, a year, 2 years, once it becomes standard, it will be what it is. Whereas now I think there's quite a bit of variation, and there's things that corporates I think might see and say, I really like that, and it adds a lot of value, which might not be the case in every offer or every structure. And the corporates are almost being able to shape and individualize and have more choices, because it's such an evolving time. At least that's, I guess, my take on it. So obviously we've talked about PPAs with storage included. We've talked lots about the benefits, but I'd be interested if you think there might be any risks in them, and if those might be things that would put either the corporates or the developers off, doing a PPA with storage.
Yep. Well, yeah, the risk is really kind of the financial risk. So we've mentioned that multiple times, but that risk is pretty quantifiable. And to date, the way that these offers have been structured, it's pretty easy to figure out what that cost is and incorporate that into the financial model for the PPA economics for the overall shared PPA plus storage economics. So that risk is pretty easy to identify. But probably the harder part is forecasting what the benefit of the storage is. That of course depends on again the market and how much intermittent versus dispatchable energy there currently is in that market, how that's going to change. Hopefully more storage is going to be added to all the markets in the future. But that, how that market values the benefits that storage can provide and how that's constantly evolving too. I think that's probably the harder part as far as forecasting. So it's not so much understanding the downside, but it's forecasting what that upside is.
That's a really interesting one, because having tried to do battery analysis myself and knowing how that rabbit hole can open up and how you can go down into things, I think one of the great things that I know that you're doing is to be able to actually, analyze those offers. I won't say levelize them, but so you clients can see on almost a like for like basis, a similar basis, what's going on. And you're right. You have to. It's harder to forecast the benefit, and you might be taking certain assumptions. But I think that's one of the crucial bits, and I think hats off. That's one of the things you guys have been doing really well. To actually, as the market's moved on, understand, pick out, and look at those offers. Okay. So that's really interesting. In terms of developers, ultimately, everything, there's a risk and a reward in it. So obviously, if you want to de-risk a PPA, there's potentially a premium. If you're going to be developing something with solar and storage, potentially you're going to end up sharing the benefits to get that project done. How do you think developers feel about the sort of benefit sharing around storage within their PPA and sharing it with off-takers?
Yeah, well, I'll talk from my experience, and I know you're closer with developers, Russell, than I am, so would love to kind of hear your thoughts too. Um, but generally, in the developers that I work with on PPAs, once they have that fixed price PPA contract in hand, from a PPA contract perspective, they should be indifferent to storage, right? They've already done what they need to on the PPA side. And then the battery storage contract for them can kind of be thought of as separately. From the PPA buyer perspective, it's definitely included, like because it's providing that additional insurance and hedge value that we've been talking about.
Hmm.
But from the developer perspective, I think that they might want to do storage just purely for their own financial benefit, and if they do, that's great. Maybe they just want to keep all that benefit to themselves. But what I've found is developers oftentimes want to unload some of that risk to another party. So whether that's the PPA off-taker party or your classic investor like infrastructure fund that invests in these projects, um, you know, either way, developers oftentimes want to diversify their risk, and then they also want to recycle the capital that they put into their projects. So having another party that can participate in that risk reward, I think kind of creates a win-win situation for both the PPA off-taker, the company buying the PPA, and the project owner of the of the renewable energy project and of the storage asset.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting. I think again it chimes with a lot of what I think I've heard. I think developers are very excited about storage, not just because it's technically clever, but I think it offers a lot in terms of things you've covered there. So it can de-risk the projects in future, because obviously if you've got high renewable penetration and you're concerned about market prices, negative pricing, low pricing, the battery can hedge, help deal with that. And it also diversifies the revenue streams. You talked about a whole raft of things there, um, from arbitrage to system services and capacity and all sorts of other things that you can do. um, so potentially it helps de-risk the project, and it helps make it more investable. And I think they also feel that there are lots of options that can be done with them. um, it's interesting. I think risk sharing is very much on their mind, and someone once said to me, the risk is best placed with those people who are best placed to manage it. And I think there is an element of risk management. I think I'm not sure if you've seen it so much in the US or if it's a thing in the US, but I think in Europe there are developers who have perhaps been a bit more traditional and who have built projects and then maybe just like flip them out and let someone operate them, or whatever, talking about becoming independent power producers, or even what they call a next gen independent power producer, where they're looking to optimize their portfolio of different assets and storage in the market to deliver more value for themselves over the long term. They're even thinking about maybe having an eye on things like what happens if hourly matching becomes something under GHG. Can we use the storage assets to better shape the output from the renewables to provide shaped load or guaranteed load or base load or whatever? There are lots of options, and I think that's why it's leading to it's really exciting. But to deliver it, we need some more revenue, but also we need to share some of the benefit to make the revenue increase make sense, the premium, should we say, to make sense for the corporate, if that makes any sense, Craig. So yeah, I kind of agree with you, and I think it's going to be a really exciting time to see how it develops.
Yeah, I'm 100% aligned on your thoughts there.
That's really good. Okay, let's a couple more things that are sort of I guess on my mind before we wrap up. So if you think about more and more storage being added to the grid, which seems very likely in the US and in Europe and in the UK and everywhere, do you have a view of how you think it might impact PPAs and storage contracts? I'd be interested to hear what you had to your thoughts on that.
Well, the more storage is added to the grid, two things. One, it's going to reduce that arbitrage value that we've been talking about because naturally it's
Yep.
going to flatten prices, which means, the peak prices aren't going to be quite as high and those low and negative prices aren't going to be quite as low. And then second, it'll reduce the risk of covariance between the renewable generation timing and the market price at that specific time. So what's known as saturation risk, like a lot of the same technology producing power at the same time, so it becomes really cheap.
Hmm.
So both of those things happening would be really good for the renewable energy PPA portion of the contract, but it might not be so good for the battery storage and especially like the arbitrage component of the battery storage part of that contract. So, and if companies again are looking at this as kind of a risk reduction insurance product, I think that could still be all right for the risk averse company that has the overall goal of financial risk reduction and, getting the the benefits again of procuring renewable energy, that environmental and sustainability and story and impact and climate benefit that companies are wanting.
Mm. I think that's very fair. I agree with that. And I think we've seen examples, in the US in ERCOT where people have done the analysis and said, look, there's a lot of battery storage. It is helping the so-called duck curve, that difference between the lowest price and the highest price. I love it. What do you call it? The risk of covariance. What a great phrase. It reduces that and stabilizes the market. But actually, it's not just raising the day; it's shrinking the peak price. So when we're using the most energy, the price is coming down, which is which is good. There is a risk in there. And you look at Europe, and I'm thinking of the UK when the sort of grid services, so-called ancillary services, there was a lot of battery capacity entered that market, and the value that you could get for it sort of crashed because there was oversupply. But it was great for the grid. It meant that actually the grid could be managed better at lower costs. So, and it's interesting, like you say, as it pulls through to PPAs, it makes sense for PPAs potentially, but the batteries cannibalize their own revenue. But ultimately, that's why markets work. When there's the money to be made through whatever mechanism, then that mechanism proliferates. Like if it's batteries, and when it doesn't, then it slows and stops, but it reaches an equilibrium. So that's really good. Um, I'm conscious we're getting towards the end of time, so I guess, Craig, do you have any closing thoughts you'd kind of like to share?
Sure. Well, first, thanks for talking with me. This has been fun. Um, and I guess maybe my ask to the developer community, the battery project owner community, is to be creative in your offers and talk with us. Obviously, I represent the buyers in these transactions, so I'm looking to get the most that I can for my clients. But really, I understand, and I know my clients understand too, that we need to look for these win-win opportunities. And everybody's realistic that these contracts and especially these really long-term contracts for like 15 years more make the most sense when both parties can be good long-term partners and are in it for both parties to benefit in the long run. So yeah, I guess, the more storage options that we see and become available, the better. Everybody loves options. The more we can discuss this like we did today, the more we can see new, unique, creative offers come to market, the more we can refine those offers, the better they'll become for everybody and they'll benefit the overall grid. And I guess they'll benefit all of us electricity users as well. So it's really only a good thing.
Excellent. That's really great. First of all, for me, thank you very much for joining me. I've really enjoyed chatting with you, and it's been interesting to get a different insight, a different point of view, and I've learned something, and not just how great Colorado is for mountain biking. So, yeah, Craig, I really appreciate you joining me. Thank you very much.
Yes, please come visit, Russell. Thank you.